The millionaire froze when he heard the cook murmuring a prayer while working. It was the same one his mother used to teach him before she vanished when he was 5. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Carter mansion, casting long shadows across Italian marble floors that nobody admired. James Carter stood at the panoramic window of his study, coffee cup in hand, gazing at the Chicago skyline without really seeing it. At 45, he'd achieved what most would consider the American dream. CEO of Carter Investments, owner of one of the most luxurious estates in the Gold Coast, and a fortune that placed him comfortably among the city's elite. Yet James Carter lived alone in his 15,000-square-foot palace of glass and stone. No wife, no children, no pets, not even a houseplant that required his personal attention. "Will that be all, Mr. Carter?" Henderson, his house manager, stood at the doorway with perfect posture, face carefully neutral. "Yes, thank you." James didn't turn around. After nearly 7 years, Henderson was accustomed to these abbreviated conversations. When the door clicked shut, James sighed and loosened his tie. The mansion employed a staff of 8, all of whom he kept at arm's length. They were professionals who maintained the immaculate facade of his life, just as his tailored suits maintained his public image. He moved to his desk and opened his laptop. Another day of acquisitions, mergers, and calculated risks. Another day of building an empire that had no heir. Jamie, never forget that the most precious things can't be bought. The memory of his mother's voice crashed through his carefully constructed mental barriers, as it occasionally did despite decades of compartmentalization. Susan Carter, a ghost that haunted the corners of his mind, especially in quiet moments like these. James caught his reflection in the window glass, his father's strong jawline, but his mother's dark, expressive eyes that now revealed nothing. He'd been 5 years old when she disappeared, too young to understand, old enough to remember. "She left us, son," his father had explained, voice gruff with what James later recognized as carefully constructed emotion. She found someone else, a different life. No note, no goodbye, just an empty bedroom and his father's growing coldness. Little Jamie had waited by the window for weeks, certain his mother would return. She'd never missed their bedtime ritual, the soft prayer she'd taught him, hand in hand, forehead to forehead, but she never came. And eventually, the waiting broke something inside him. Richard Carter had thrown himself into expanding his business after Susan left. Leaving James in the care of a rotation of nannies, the boy learned early that attachment was dangerous. By the time he entered boarding school at 11, James had mastered the art of self-sufficiency. Now, 35 years after her abandonment, James had become a man whom Susan Carter wouldn't recognize. Calculated, controlled, and completely alone. His phone rang, breaking his reverie. "James Carter," he answered, voice crisp. "Mr. Carter, it's Diane from HR. I wanted to inform you that we filled the head chef position. She starts today." James frowned slightly. "I thought Peterson was handling the domestic staffing." "Mr. Peterson is on vacation this week, sir. He left instructions that the position needed to be filled immediately since Mrs. Lambert gave such short notice. The new chef comes highly recommended from the Crawfords. Her references check out perfectly." "Fine," James said. Cooking staff came and went. It hardly mattered to him. "What's her name?" "Susan Ramirez. She's already being shown around by Henderson." Something tightened in James's chest. "Susan," he repeated, the name feeling strange in his mouth after avoiding it for so many years. "Yes, sir. Will there be anything else?" "No, thank you, Diane." James put down the phone and checked his watch. He had a board meeting in an hour. The name was a coincidence, nothing more. Susan was a common name. He pushed the discomfort aside and gathered his files. The day passed in a blur of meetings and conference calls. When James returned home after 9 p.m., the mansion was quiet as usual. He'd texted Henderson earlier to say he'd eaten downtown. Though in truth, he'd only picked at an overpriced steak while reviewing quarterly projections, James loosened his tie as he walked through the silent hallways. The scent caught him off guard. Warm, homemade bread. He followed it instinctively to the kitchen, a room he rarely entered. The kitchen lights were still on. Unusual for this hour. He paused at the doorway, watching an older woman with silver-streaked black hair tied in a practical bun. She moved with practiced efficiency, cleaning the last of the dinner preparations, while something baked in the oven. She was humming softly to herself, unaware of his presence. "Hello?" James said, slightly uncomfortable at finding someone in his space so late. The woman startled, turning quickly. "Oh, Mr. Carter, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize you were home." Her accent was slight but noticeable. Her English perfect, but with hints of Spanish underneath. "You must be the new chef," he said, stepping into the kitchen but maintaining his distance. "Yes, sir, Susan Ramirez." She wiped her hands nervously on her apron. "I was just finishing up. I left dinner in the warming drawer as Mr. Henderson instructed." Something about her eyes caught James's attention. They were dark and kind, with fine lines at the corners that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. She was perhaps in her early 60s, with an air of quiet dignity, despite her obvious nervousness. "That's fine," James said. "Don't let me interrupt, He paused, realizing he had no reason to be in the kitchen. "I smelled bread." Susan's expression softened slightly. "Yes, sourdough. It's just about done. Would you like some?" "It's best fresh from the oven." The question caught James off guard. Staff didn't usually offer him things directly. Everything in the house operated according to established protocols. Meals at certain times. Preferences documented and followed without discussion. "No, thank you," he said automatically, then immediately regretted it, as disappointment flickered across her face. "Of course, I apologize for overstepping." "You didn't." James felt suddenly awkward, like a stranger in his own home. "I should let you finish up. Good night, Mrs. Ramirez." "Good night, Mr. Carter, and it's just Miss, or Donna Susan, as most people call me." James nodded and left the kitchen, disturbed by the encounter in ways he couldn't articulate. Something about Donna Susan seemed oddly familiar, though he was certain they'd never met before. He made his way to his bedroom suite, which occupied the entire east wing of the 3rd floor. The space was immaculate as always, but tonight it felt especially empty. James loosened his tie and stared out at the city lights, mind drifting to the woman downstairs. There had been something in her eyes, a sadness that resonated with him. It was ridiculous, of course. She was just another employee, another person passing through his life without leaving a mark. Yet, as he prepared for bed, James found himself thinking of his mother for the second time that day. Something that hadn't happened in years, he wondered, as he had countless times as a child. What could have made her leave without a word? What kind of life had she built without him? Was she even still alive? James Carter climbed into his king-sized bed alone, as he did every night, in a mansion full of people who knew nothing about him, in a life built on achievement but devoid of connection. He was asleep when, 3 floors below, Donna Susan closed the kitchen for the night, whispering a quiet prayer as she turned out the lights. For 3 weeks, James barely saw the new chef. Their paths rarely crossed. He left early each morning and typically returned late, often after Donna Susan had finished for the day. When they did encounter each other, their interactions were brief and professional. A nod in the hallway, a polite, "Good morning," when he unexpectedly found her preparing breakfast on the rare days he worked from home. Yet somehow, her presence had changed the atmosphere of the mansion. Small things that James couldn't quite identify but sensed nonetheless. Fresh flowers on the breakfast table, the subtle, comforting aromas that lingered even hours after she'd finished cooking, the sound of Spanish music drifting faintly from the kitchen when he passed. It was a Thursday evening when everything changed. James had canceled his dinner meeting, finding himself mentally exhausted after a tense day of negotiations. He returned home earlier than usual, around 7, and decided to eat in for once. "Mr. Carter," Henderson said, clearly surprised to see him. "We weren't expecting you this evening." "Change of plans," James replied simply. "Is there anything for dinner?" "Of course, sir. Donna Susan always prepares something in case you return. I'll have it served in the dining room." "No need," James said. "I'll just eat in the kitchen." Henderson's eyebrows rose slightly. "The kitchen, sir?" "Yes, Henderson. The kitchen? Is that a problem?" "Not at all. I'll inform Donna Susan." James changed into more casual clothes, still slacks and a button-down. But without the tie and jacket, and made his way downstairs, he rarely used the informal spaces of his own home, typically eating in the massive dining room when he did dine in, which was itself a rarity. The kitchen was the heart of any home, or so people said. His had always been just another room. When he pushed open the swinging door, Donna Susan was at the stove, stirring something that smelled incredible. She looked up, clearly flustered. "Mr. Carter, Henderson said you'd be eating in. I'm just warming everything up for you. Actually, I thought I might eat here, he said, gesturing to the small table in the corner of the spacious kitchen. If that's not an inconvenience. Here. She looked genuinely surprised. Of course not. It's your home, let me just... She hurried to clear some cookbooks and a notepad from the table, which was clearly where she took her own meals. James washed his hands at the sink and then sat down, suddenly uncomfortable. This was a mistake. He was intruding on her space. But before he could change his mind, Donna Susan placed a steaming bowl in front of him. It's chile verde, she explained. Pork shoulder slow-cooked with green chilies, tomatillos, and spices. She set down a small basket of warm tortillas beside it. Would you like something to drink? I have fresh lemonade or perhaps something stronger? Lemonade is fine, James said, surprised by the homey meal. His regular chef had typically prepared elaborate restaurant-style dishes, beautiful but impersonal. As she poured his drink, James took a bite. The flavors were complex and comforting. Spicy, yet somehow soothing. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had food that tasted so personal. This is excellent, he said when she returned with his lemonade. Thank you. Her smile was warm but reserved. It's my family recipe. Have you eaten? He asked, the question surprising even himself. I was just about to, after finishing up here. James hesitated, then gestured to the chair across from him. Please, join me, unless you'd rather not. Donna Susan looked uncertain for a moment, then nodded. Let me get my plate. They ate in silence for a few minutes. James awkwardly aware that he'd created this situation, but had no idea how to navigate it. He couldn't remember the last time he'd shared a meal with someone in his own home, outside of formal dinner parties with business associates. How are you finding the position so far? He finally asked. It's very good work. Thank you. Everyone has been kind. She took a sip of her lemonade. Your home is beautiful. Thank you, though I can't take credit for it. The interior designers handled everything. She nodded, glancing around the kitchen. Still, a house becomes what its people make it. Something about her phrasing struck James. And what has this house become, in your opinion? Donna Susan looked startled by the question, then contemplative. Forgive me if this sounds forward, but it feels like a place waiting to become a home. The observation was so accurate, it was uncomfortable. James changed the subject. Henderson mentioned you worked for the Crawfords previously. Yes, for almost 7 years. I left when they relocated to Boston. She carefully folded her tortilla. Before that, many other families. I've moved quite a bit over the years. James noticed how she deflected personal questions with vague answers. He recognized the technique. He used it himself. They continued with safer topics. The upcoming change in seasons. A recent exhibit at the Art Institute. Her thoughts on improving the kitchen's organization. James found himself oddly relaxed for the first time in, he couldn't remember how long. As they finished eating, Donna Susan stood to clear their plates. Would you like coffee or perhaps dessert? I made flan earlier. Both sound good, James replied. Not ready to end the evening, she nodded and turned toward the sink to rinse the dishes. As she worked, she began to hum softly. Then the humming transformed into a whispered singing. It was so quiet James could barely make it out, but something about the melody caught his attention. Then she began to murmur words as she worked, her voice low and soothing. Ángel de mi guarda, mi dulce compañía. No me desampares ni de noche ni de día. James froze, fork suspended midway to his mouth. No me dejes solo que me perdería. His heart pounded as the prayer continued, each word hitting him like a physical force. He knew this prayer. Not just recognized it, he knew it in his bones. Hasta que me pongas en paz y alegría con todos los santos, Jesús, José y María. It was the prayer his mother had taught him, the one they recited together each night before bed, the guardian angel prayer, first in English, then in Spanish, just as his mother had learned it from her own Mexican grandmother. Donna Susan turned, carrying the flan and coffee, and stopped when she saw his face. Mr. Carter, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost. James couldn't speak for a moment. Finally, he managed, that prayer, where did you learn it? She set down the dessert, looking confused. It's a common Catholic prayer, the guardian angel prayer. Many children learn it. My mother taught it to me, James said quietly, exactly as you were saying it, first in English, then in Spanish. Something flickered across Donna Susan's face. Surprise, perhaps a shadow of pain, before her expression returned to its professional calm. "It's a beautiful prayer," she said softly. "I taught it to my son as well." "Your son?" James hadn't considered that she might have children. "Yes." Her eyes grew distant, though I lost him many years ago. Before James could ask what she meant, Henderson appeared at the kitchen door. "Excuse me?" "Mr. Carter, your father is on the phone. He says it's urgent." The spell was broken. James stood, nodding to Donna Susan. "Thank you for dinner, and the company." "Of course, Mr. Carter." As James left to take his father's call, his mind was racing. The prayer, her voice, something about her eyes. It all stirred memories he'd tried to bury decades ago. That night, for the first time in years, James dreamed of his mother. In the dream, she was reading him a story, her face blurry but her voice clear. When he woke suddenly at 3 a.m., he realized he was whispering the guardian angel prayer into the darkness. James sat in his Tesla, parked across the street from a modest brick apartment building in Pilsen. According to Henderson's personnel files, this was where Donna Susan lived, a second-floor walk-up in the predominantly Mexican-American neighborhood. He'd been sitting there for 20 minutes, not entirely sure what he was doing or why. The encounter with the prayer had shaken him more than he cared to admit. For 3 days afterward, he'd avoided the kitchen, returning to his habit of eating out or having meals sent to his study. But he couldn't stop thinking about Donna Susan, about the strange familiarity he felt in her presence. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Richard Carter's name flashed on the screen. James let it go to voicemail, as he had the last 3 calls from his father. Their relationship had become increasingly strained over the past few years, as James asserted more independence in how he ran the family business. Instead, he scrolled through his contacts and found the number for Miguel Hernandez, a private investigator he'd used occasionally for pre-employment screenings of high-level executives. Hernandez was discreet, thorough, and, most importantly, wouldn't ask unnecessary questions. The call connected on the second ring. Hernandez. "Miguel, it's James Carter. I need your services for a personal matter." "Of course." "Mr. Carter, what can I do for you?" James hesitated. "I need a background check on someone, more thorough than usual. I want to know everything. Where they've been, what they've done, who they really are." "I understand. Who's the subject?" "Susan Ramirez. She's currently employed as my chef. I have her current address and social security number." "Any specific areas of concern?" Miguel's voice was neutral. "Professional. Nothing I can articulate clearly. Just be thorough. Look for inconsistencies, name changes, anything that doesn't add up. And I need you to be exceptionally discreet. She can't know she's being investigated." "Understood. I'll handle it personally. When do you need this by?" "As soon as possible. I'll pay a premium for expedited work. I'll get started today. I'll have something preliminary for you by the end of the week." After ending the call, James continued to sit in his car, watching Donna Susan's building. What was he looking for? What did he expect to find? The rational part of his brain told him this was absurd. Plenty of Catholic mothers taught their children that prayer. It was a coincidence. Nothing more. Yet something deeper, more instinctive, wouldn't let it go. A movement caught his eye. Donna Susan emerged from the building, carrying a small shopping bag. She wore a simple dress with a light cardigan, her hair in its usual practical bun. James slumped down slightly in his seat. Feeling ridiculous, he was a 45-year-old CEO hiding in his car like a teenager. He watched as she walked to the corner, where she stopped to chat with an elderly flower vendor. They spoke in Spanish, their conversation animated and warm. Donna Susan bought a small bunch of daisies before continuing down the street. There was something about her walk, a certain grace despite her age, a way of holding herself with quiet dignity, that triggered another flicker of memory. James started the car. This was pointless. He had a company to run, not time to play amateur detective. 2 days later, James was reviewing quarterly projections in his home office when his phone buzzed with a text from Miguel. "Initial findings ready. Can meet today." James agreed to a meeting at a discreet coffee shop in Lincoln Park. When he arrived, Miguel was already there, a manila folder on the table beside his coffee. "Mr. Carter." Miguel stood to shake his hand. "I appreciate your promptness." Once they were seated, Miguel opened the folder. I have some preliminary information, though nothing that raises immediate red flags. Tell me what you found, James said, trying to keep his tone casual. Susan Ramirez, born Susan Alvarez in Nogales, Arizona, 63 years old, attended community college for 2 years. Studying culinary arts but never completed her degree. Married Roberto Ramirez at 22, widowed at 31 when he died in a construction accident. Miguel slid over a photocopy of an old driver's license. James studied the much younger face of Donna Susan, feeling that same tug of recognition. Employment history is consistent with what she provided on her application. She's worked for several wealthy families in different cities over the past 30 years, never staying more than 5 to 7 years with each employer. Good references all around. And before she started domestic work, Miguel consulted his notes. That's where things get a bit hazier. There's a gap of about 3 years after her husband's death where I can't find much record of employment. She moved several times during that period. Phoenix, San Diego, briefly in Los Angeles. What about children? She mentioned having a son. Miguel nodded. That's in her records. She had one child, a son named James Ramirez, born when she was 23. James felt a strange jolt at hearing his own name. Where is he now? Miguel's expression turned somber. According to public records, James Ramirez died at age 8 in a drowning accident. The information hit James with unexpected force. She lost her child, he murmured, remembering the sorrow he'd glimpsed in her eyes when she mentioned her son. Yes, about a year after her husband died. That likely explains the gap in her employment history and the moves. Grief. Trying to start over. James sat back, processing this information. A woman who'd lost everything. Husband, child, stability, yet somehow rebuilt a life of quiet dignity. It explained the sadness he sensed in her, but it didn't explain the connection he felt, or the nagging familiarity. There's one other thing, Miguel added, pulling out another document. I found this in an archived newspaper database. It might be nothing. But given what you asked me to look for, inconsistencies, things that don't add up, this caught my attention. He pushed across a printout of an old newspaper article. The headline read, "Local woman sought for questioning in financial fraud case." James scanned the article. It mentioned a Susan Carter, wife of prominent businessman Richard Carter, who had disappeared shortly after questions arose about missing funds at her husband's company. The article was dated 35 years ago. The timing aligns with when she began using the name Ramirez consistently, Miguel explained. Before that, records for Susan Alvarez get spotty, and there's a physical resemblance between this Susan Carter and your Susan Ramirez, despite the age difference. James stared at the grainy newspaper photo. The woman in the picture was much younger, her hair dark without the silver streaks, her face unlined. But the eyes, those were the same eyes he'd been seeing in his kitchen. I need you to dig deeper, James said, his voice tight. Find everything you can about Susan Carter and what happened to her. And I want to know more about this fraud case. What exactly my father accused her of. Miguel's eyebrows rose slightly at the mention of Richard Carter. Your father? Then this Susan Carter would be my mother. James finished, the word feeling strange on his tongue after so many years. My mother, who supposedly abandoned me when I was 5 years old. Miguel nodded slowly. I'll focus my investigation accordingly. This changes the parameters considerably. Complete discretion is even more essential now. No one can know about this. Not my father, not anyone at my company, and especially not Donna Susan. Understood, Mr. Carter. As James drove home, his mind raced. Could it really be possible after all these years? Could his mother be living under his own roof, cooking his meals, murmuring the same prayer she'd taught him as a child? And if so, why hadn't she recognized him? Then again, he'd been 5 when she left. Now he was a middle-aged man who looked more like his father with each passing year, and she believed her son, her James, had died decades ago. That night, James found himself walking past the kitchen several times, hoping to catch a glimpse of Donna Susan, but Henderson informed him she had left early for a doctor's appointment. James sat alone in his study, staring at the newspaper article Miguel had given him. The young woman in the photo stared back, her eyes hauntingly familiar. Who are you really? He whispered to the faded image. And what happened 35 years ago? James couldn't sleep. He sat in his home office at 2 a.m., scrolling through old family photos on his laptop. Most were formal, staged affairs. The Carters at charity galas, business functions, or awkwardly posed in front of Christmas trees in almost every image. His father's hand rested on young James's shoulder, a proprietorial gesture that never conveyed warmth. But in the oldest photos, from before his mother left, there was a different quality. Susan Carter's smile reached her eyes. She held James against her, not beside her. There was life in those images. A genuine connection that had vanished from all the photos that followed. James enlarged one particular image. Himself at about 4, sitting on his mother's lap as she read him a story. Her dark hair fell forward, partially obscuring her face, but her profile was visible. He compared it to the staff photo Henderson had taken of Donna Susan for the mansion's security records. The resemblance was striking, even accounting for the 35-year gap. Same high cheekbones, same graceful neck, same slight tilt of the head. His phone buzzed with a text from Miguel. "Found something. Need to meet." "Now," James texted back. "Important, monocle coffee. 30 minutes." The coffee shop was deserted at that hour, save for a barista who looked half asleep, and Miguel, who sat in the farthest corner booth with a thick folder. "This couldn't wait until morning?" James asked, sliding into the booth. "I didn't think so." Miguel pushed a document across the table. "Look at this." It was a copy of an old police report. James skimmed it quickly, then went back to read more carefully. "This is a missing person report," he said slowly. "For Susan Carter. Filed by your mother's sister, Elena Alvarez, 3 days after Susan disappeared. According to the report, Elena was concerned because Susan had called her the night before. Sounding frightened, she told her sister she needed to get away from Richard and would explain everything soon. Elena never heard from her again. James felt cold. My father told everyone she left willingly, that she abandoned us. There's more." Miguel slid over a faded photocopy of a handwritten letter. "This was in the police file, provided by Elena as evidence. It's the last communication she received from your mother, sent overnight express the day before she disappeared." James's hands trembled slightly as he read. "Elena, I don't have much time. I've discovered things about Richard's business that terrify me. He's involved in something illegal. Money laundering, I think. When I confronted him, he threatened me. Not directly, but I know what he meant. I'm going to take Jamie and leave tonight while Richard is at his club meeting. I've packed a small bag for us. We'll come to you first, then figure out where to go from there. If you don't hear from me by tomorrow, something has gone wrong. Please contact Detective Martinez. He's been helping me gather evidence. Trust no one else. Love, Susan." "She was planning to take me with her," James whispered, the realization like a physical blow. "She didn't abandon me. She was trying to protect me." "It appears so," Miguel said quietly. "But something went wrong, according to the police file. When they questioned your father, he showed them a note supposedly written by Susan, saying she was leaving him for another man. He also had witnesses who claimed to have seen her getting into a car with a male companion. The police investigation stalled after that, and this Detective Martinez, found dead 2 weeks later. Apparent suicide, though the circumstances were questionable. The case was officially closed a month after that." James stared at the documents, trying to process the implications. "What about the fraud allegations against my mother? The newspaper article mentioned missing funds." "That's where it gets interesting." Miguel pulled out several financial documents. "I managed to access some archived records from Carter Investments. There was indeed money missing, about $2 million. But the paper trail initially pointed to your mother seemed fabricated, too convenient, too clear. My father framed her," James said flatly. "It wasn't a question. I can't prove that conclusively yet, but the evidence certainly suggests it. There are discrepancies in the documentation, signatures that don't quite match her known handwriting, timestamps that don't align with her known whereabouts." James felt nauseous. "So my mother discovers my father is involved in criminal activity, threatens to expose him, tries to take me away to safety, and then, what? He somehow stops her, frames her for his own crimes, and makes her disappear, and then creates a narrative that she abandoned you both. It's a classic misdirection, making the victim look like the criminal." James stood abruptly, pacing the small coffee shop. But she didn't just disappear. She's alive. She's been working as a domestic for decades. Why didn't she ever come back for me? Why didn't she fight the allegations? That's still unclear, Miguel admitted. But given the suspicious death of the detective who was helping her, and your father's apparent reach and influence, she may have been afraid, or perhaps she tried and was thwarted in ways we haven't discovered yet. James returned to the booth, feeling drained. I need to know everything, Miguel. Every detail of what happened back then, and everything that's happened to Susan Ramirez, Susan Carter, in the years since. I'm working on it. But these records are old. Many are sealed or have been destroyed. It will take time. Time is the one thing I don't have. She's in my house now, but she could leave at any moment. And if she is my mother, I need to know why she's there. Is it coincidence? Or did she discover who I am? Miguel shook his head. According to my investigation, she genuinely believes her son died. She has visited a grave in San Diego on the same date each year, the anniversary of James Ramirez's death. The grief appears genuine. James fell silent, contemplating this. So she has no idea who I am. It appears not. Keep digging. Miguel, I need to understand everything before I decide what to do next. Back at the mansion, James found himself drawn to the kitchen. It was after 4 a.m., but a light was on. He pushed open the door to find Donna Susan kneading bread dough, her back to him. You're up early, he said quietly. She startled, turning quickly. Mr. Carter, I'm sorry if I disturbed you. I like to get the bread started before breakfast. You didn't disturb me. I couldn't sleep. She nodded understandingly, continuing to work the dough with practiced motions. My abuela always said that when sleep runs from you, it's because your soul is trying to work something out. James watched her hands. Strong, capable hands with slight age spots but still graceful. The same hands that might have held him as a child. The other day, you mentioned your son, he said, trying to keep his voice casual. James, right. You said you lost him. Pain flickered across her face before she composed herself. Yes, he drowned when he was 8. It was a very long time ago. I'm sorry, James said, meaning it with an intensity that surprised him. That must have been devastating. She kept her eyes on her work. It changes you, losing a child. The world becomes divided into before and after, but God gives us strength to continue, even when we think we cannot. And his father, your husband, Roberto died a year before, a construction accident. She shaped the dough into a round loaf. James was all I had left. So you've been alone all these years. James couldn't imagine the isolation she must have felt. She looked up then, her dark eyes meeting his. Not alone. I've had my faith, my work, the families I've served, different kinds of companionship. She smiled slightly. And I talk to my Jamie every day in my prayers. Jamie, not James, but Jamie, the nickname his mother had used for him. We're all haunted by something. Aren't we? James said softly. Yes, she agreed. But ghosts can bring comfort as well as pain, Mr. Carter. They remind us that love doesn't end, even when people leave us. James watched as she covered the dough with a cloth to rise, her movements infused with a grace that transcended the mundane task. He wondered what she would say if he told her his suspicions right now. Would she recognize the truth? Or would the decades of believing her son dead make it impossible to see him in the man before her? Would you like some tea? She offered. I was about to make some for myself. Yes, James said, suddenly not wanting to leave this quiet, pre-dawn moment. I'd like that very much. As they sat at the kitchen table, steam rising from their cups, James studied her face surreptitiously. She caught him looking and smiled questioningly. I'm sorry, he said. You just remind me of someone. An old friend. Perhaps, she suggested. No, James replied softly. Someone I lost a long time ago. Richard Carter's penthouse overlooked Lake Michigan from the 78th floor of one of Chicago's most exclusive buildings. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased a panoramic view of the city he'd helped shape through decades of investment and development. At 73, Richard remained striking, his silver hair perfectly cut, his posture military straight despite his years. James, he greeted his son with a firm handshake rather than an embrace. This is unexpected. You've been dodging my calls? I've been busy, James replied. stepping past his father into the sleek, modern space designed more for impressing visitors than providing comfort. Too busy for your old man. That's the problem with success. It makes you forget who helped you get there. Richard moved to the bar. Drink? No, thanks. This isn't a social call. Richard paused, ice cubes suspended over his glass. Business, then. Something wrong at the company. Not company business, family business. Richard's expression hardened almost imperceptibly as he poured his scotch. That sounds ominous. James studied his father, seeing him with new eyes, not as the stern but respected figure of his childhood, but as a man capable of deception so deep it had shaped both their lives. I want to talk about Mom, James said bluntly. Richard took a measured sip of his drink. Susan. What on earth for? She's been gone for 40 years. 35 years, James corrected. And I think it's time I knew the truth about what happened. We've been through this before. She left us. Found someone else. What more is there to say? Richard's tone was dismissive, but James caught the tension in his shoulders. Like the police report filed by Aunt Elena when Mom went missing, or the letter Mom sent her the day before she disappeared, saying she'd discovered something illegal in your business and was planning to take me with her when she left. The color drained from Richard's face. Where did you... Or how about the fact that the detective who was helping her died under suspicious circumstances just weeks later, or the rather convenient trail of evidence showing Mom had embezzled company funds despite discrepancies in the signatures and timestamps? Richard set down his glass carefully. You've been digging into ancient history. That's never healthy, son. Don't call me that, James snapped, surprising himself with the sudden fury in his voice. Not until you tell me the truth. Did my mother really abandon us? Or did you drive her away and then destroy her reputation to cover your tracks? Richard's expression shifted to something colder, more calculating. You're making dangerous accusations based on incomplete information, James. Whatever you think you've uncovered, you're missing crucial context. Then give me the context, James challenged. Tell me what really happened. It was a complicated time, Richard said, turning to look out at the city. The business was in trouble. Cash flow problems, investors pulling out. I made some questionable decisions to keep us afloat. You were laundering money, James stated flatly. Richard gave a small shrug. Among other things, it was temporary. Just until I could turn the company around. And Mom found out. Yes, she didn't understand the business world, the necessary compromises. You mean the crimes? Richard shot him an irritated look. She threatened to go to the authorities, said she wouldn't have her son raised by a criminal. So she didn't leave me. She was trying to protect me. Richard's jaw tightened. She was naive. She would have destroyed everything I built, everything that eventually became your inheritance. What did you do to her? James's voice was dangerously quiet. Nothing as dramatic as you're imagining, Richard said with a dismissive wave. I simply made sure she understood the consequences of her actions. That if she went to the authorities, she'd be implicated too. That she'd lose custody of you completely. You threatened her. I negotiated, Richard corrected. Offered her money to disappear quietly, enough to start over somewhere else. And the embezzlement accusations, the newspaper stories about her running off with another man. Richard sipped his scotch. Insurance, in case she changed her mind about our arrangement. James felt sick. Did she take the money? No, Richard admitted. She was stubborn, said she didn't want my dirty money, said she'd find another way. To do what? Take me with her. Richard's expression darkened. That was never going to happen. You were my son, my heir. Your possession, you mean? James said bitterly. So what really happened the night she disappeared? The truth, Dad. Richard was silent for a long moment. She came to take you, he finally said. I was supposed to be at my club meeting, but I'd anticipated she might try something. I caught her packing your things. James could picture it. His mother frantically stuffing clothes into a bag, his father confronting her. And then, we argued. It got heated. She was hysterical, saying she'd rather live in poverty than let you be raised by me. Richard's voice held a trace of the old anger, as if she could have given you anything close to the life I provided. What happened next? James pressed. She ran, left without you. I assumed she'd cool off, come to her senses, but she never came back. That's not the whole story, James said, certain he was still being lied to. What about the missing person report? Elena's statement that Mom had promised to call but never did. Richard's expression hardened. Your aunt was always dramatic. Susan probably contacted her later but made her keep it quiet. And Detective Martinez's convenient suicide. I had nothing to do with that, Richard said sharply. The man had gambling debts, a drinking problem. It wasn't surprising he took the easy way out. James studied his father's face, looking for tells, for the micro-expressions that might reveal deception. But Richard Carter hadn't built an empire by being easily read. You know what I think, James said quietly. I think you're still lying. I think something worse happened that night, and you've spent 35 years covering it up. Richard finished his scotch in one swallow. Think what you want. It won't change anything. Susan is gone, has been for decades. What's the point of dredging up ancient history? Because my mother deserves justice. And because I deserve the truth. Richard gave a hollow laugh. Justice, truth. What good are those compared to what we've built? Look at your life, James. The wealth, the power, the respect. Would you have had any of that if Susan had dragged you away to live in some shabby apartment, always on the run? Maybe I'd have had something more valuable, James said. A mother who loved me. A life not built on lies. Sentimental nonsense. Richard scoffed. You sound just like her. I'll take that as a compliment. James turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. Do you know the name Susan Ramirez? Richard's expression didn't change, but James caught the slight pause before he answered. Should I? Just curious, James said, watching his father carefully. She's my new chef. Reminds me of someone, that's all. For just a moment, something flashed in Richard's eyes. Recognition, alarm. But it vanished so quickly James couldn't be sure. I don't know every member of your household staff, James. Of course not. Just thought the name might ring a bell. As James rode the elevator down, he replayed the conversation in his mind. His father hadn't told him everything. That much was clear. And his reaction to Susan's name, though subtle, suggested he might know more than he admitted. His phone buzzed with a text from Miguel. Found something big. Meeting tonight. James texted back a confirmation, then stepped out into the bright spring afternoon. The city bustled around him. People rushing by, wrapped in their own lives, their own stories. Somewhere in this same city, his mother had walked these streets decades ago, frightened and alone, separated from her child. The thought filled him with a quiet, cold rage. Whatever it took, however long it required, he would uncover the full truth about what his father had done. And if Susan Ramirez truly was Susan Carter, his mother, he would find a way to bring her justice. The lights of Navy Pier sparkled across the water as James sat in his parked car, waiting for Miguel. After his confrontation with Richard, he'd been too agitated to return to the office or the mansion. Instead, he'd driven aimlessly along Lakeshore Drive for nearly an hour, his father's half-truths and evasions replaying in his mind. A sharp tap on the passenger window startled him. Miguel slid into the seat, carrying a weathered leather briefcase. I didn't want to meet somewhere public for this, Miguel explained, opening the briefcase. What I found? It's explosive, Mr. Carter. James, he corrected absently. Just call me James. Miguel nodded, pulling out several folders. I managed to access sealed records from an interstate financial crimes investigation from 35 years ago. Your father's name appears throughout, though he was never formally charged. What kind of crimes? Money laundering, primarily. Carter Investments was used to clean money for several organized crime families in the Midwest. The operation was sophisticated. Multiple shell companies, offshore accounts, legitimate businesses used as fronts. James felt a chill despite the car's warmth. And my mother discovered this. More than discovered it, Miguel said, handing over a document. She was cooperating with the FBI. James stared at the paper. A confidential informant agreement signed by Susan Carter. She was gathering evidence against him. Yes, for at least 3 months before her disappearance, the agent handling her case was suspicious when she suddenly vanished. But without her testimony, the case against your father fell apart. So he didn't just threaten her or pay her off, James said slowly. He discovered she was informing on him. It appears so, and there's more. Miguel hesitated. I found records related to Roberto Ramirez's death, the supposed husband of Susan Ramirez. Supposed. Roberto Ramirez existed, but there's no record he was ever married to anyone named Susan Alvarez, in fact. He died single, with his mother listed as next of kin. The construction accident was real, but the marriage appears to have been fabricated. James processed this. She created a false identity, complete with a tragic backstory. A very effective one. The dead husband provides a plausible reason for her to be alone, arouses sympathy, and discourages too many personal questions, and claiming to have lost a child makes people uncomfortable enough that they don't pry. James finished. The perfect cover. Miguel nodded. I also tracked down one of the agents who was involved in the original investigation into your father. He's retired now, living in Arizona. When I mentioned Susan Carter, he had plenty to say, such as that the night she disappeared, your father's security chief, a man named Victor Kruger, was seen at the Carter estate. Kruger had connections to the same criminal organizations your father was laundering money for. His specialty was making problems disappear. Jesus, James whispered. You think my father had her killed? Not necessarily. The agent believes she escaped, possibly with Kruger's unexpected help. Apparently, Kruger had his own daughter around your age at the time. The theory is, he couldn't bring himself to harm a mother trying to protect her child, so he helped her flee instead. Relief washed over James. That would explain how she survived, why she created a new identity. She was hiding from my father all these years, but it doesn't explain why she never came back for you, Miguel pointed out gently. Unless, James's mind raced, unless she thought it wasn't safe, or unless my father convinced her it was better for me if she stayed away. Miguel's expression was grave. There's another possibility, James. One we have to consider. What? That your father told her you were dead. The words hit James like a physical blow. He wouldn't, but even as he protested, he knew his father was entirely capable of such cruelty. It would explain everything, Miguel continued. Why she created a new identity that included a dead son. Why she never tried to find you. She's been grieving you for 35 years, just as you've been believing she abandoned you. James closed his eyes. Overwhelmed by the implications, if true, it was a deception of staggering proportions. 2 lives derailed by lies. I need proof, he said finally. Something concrete that proves Susan Ramirez is actually my mother, and evidence that my father told her I was dead. I'm still working on that, Miguel admitted. But there's something else you should see. He handed over an old newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. This ran in a small San Diego paper 34 years ago. It was an obituary notice. James Carter, 8, beloved son of Susan, died tragically on May 12, 1991. Private services were held. The family requests privacy during this difficult time. It's fake, Miguel explained. I checked all death records in California for that period. No James Carter died on that date or any date close to it. But if Susan was hiding in San Diego at the time, she would have seen it, James finished. My father made sure of it. Exactly. And the timing lines up with when the records for Susan Ramirez's son begin to appear. After this date, she began visiting a child's grave regularly in San Diego. James felt physically ill. So my mother has spent 3 decades believing I'm dead, while I grew up thinking she abandoned me, all because my father couldn't risk her testimony against him. He slammed his hand against the steering wheel. God damn him. What will you do now? Miguel asked quietly. I need to know for certain that Donna Susan is my mother before I do anything, James said. DNA testing could confirm it, but I'd need a sample from her without raising suspicions. That could be arranged. Miguel nodded. A glass she's used. A hairbrush. Anything with cellular material. Do it, James said. And keep digging into what happened the night she disappeared. I want the complete truth before I confront my father again. When James returned to the mansion, the house was quiet. Henderson informed him that Donna Susan had already left for the day. Disappointed but relieved. He wasn't sure he could face her right now without revealing what he suspected. James retreated to his study. On his desk, he found a small white envelope with his name written in neat, precise handwriting. Inside was a brief note. Mr. Carter, I made pozole verde for tomorrow. It's in the refrigerator with heating instructions. It was my son's favorite dish. I thought you might enjoy it as well, Donna Susan. The simple note nearly undid him. He He sat heavily in his chair, imagining her writing it, thinking of her dead son while preparing the dish for her employer, never suspecting they were one and the same person. His phone rang, startling him. The screen showed his father's name. "What do you want?" James answered coldly. "We need to finish our conversation," Richard said, his voice tight. "About Susan Ramirez." James's heart stuttered. "What about her?" "I want her fired immediately." "On what grounds?" "I don't need grounds. She's a domestic employee, not a corporate executive. Fire her and be done with it." "Why the sudden interest in my household staff, Dad?" James kept his voice deliberately casual. "Don't play games," Richard snapped. "I know you've been investigating me, digging up ancient history. Now suddenly you hire a woman named Susan. It's not subtle, James. I didn't hire her because of her name. That's a coincidence. I don't believe in coincidences. Get rid of her, or I'll have to take matters into my own hands." A chill ran down James's spine. Is that a threat? It's advice from a father who knows better than his son. "Drop this, James. Some doors are better left closed." The line went dead. James stared at the phone, his father's veiled threat hanging in the air. Richard had recognized the name Susan Ramirez. He saw her as a threat, which confirmed James's suspicions more definitely than any DNA test could. Donna Susan was almost certainly his mother, and his father knew it. The question now was, what would Richard Carter do to keep his secrets buried? For 3 days after Richard's threatening call, James barely left the mansion. He canceled meetings, delegated urgent matters to his executive team, and worked exclusively from home. The reason he gave was a strategic planning retreat. The truth was that he feared leaving Donna Susan unprotected. He'd instructed Henderson to notify him whenever she arrived and left. He'd had Miguel run background checks on every member of his household staff, looking for any connections to his father. He'd even installed additional security cameras around the property, monitored directly to his phone. Susan noticed the changes. James caught her watching him with concern as he paced the kitchen during her preparations. Checking his phone constantly, he tried to appear normal, engaging her in casual conversation about recipes and ingredients, but he could sense her growing unease. "Mr. Carter," she said finally on the third morning, setting down her knife as she paused in chopping vegetables. "Is everything all right?" James looked up from his coffee, startled by the directness of her question. "What do you mean? You seem worried, and you've been home so much lately." She wiped her hands on her apron. "If there's anything I can do..." "I'm fine," he interrupted, too quickly. "Just some business concerns." She studied him, her dark eyes penetrating in a way that reminded him forcefully of his childhood. His mother always knew when he was hiding something. "Of course," she said finally, returning to her chopping. "But if you need anything, please let me know." James nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in his throat. The irony crushed him. His mother offering to help, unaware that she was the one in potential danger, unaware that he was her long-lost son. His phone buzzed. A text from Miguel. "We need to meet. Found something crucial." "I have to go out," James said, standing abruptly. "Will you be here when I return?" Something in his tone made Susan look up again. "Yes, I'm working until 6 today. Is there something you'd like me to prepare for dinner?" "No, just be careful," he said, immediately regretting the words when alarm flickered across her face. "Careful? I mean, with the kitchen knives," he improvised lamely. "That one looks sharp." Her expression shifted to confusion, but she nodded. "I'll be careful, Mr. Carter." Miguel was waiting in the usual coffee shop, but this time he wasn't alone. A thin, elderly man with a neatly trimmed white beard sat beside him. "James," Miguel greeted him. "This is Agent Frank Donnelly, retired FBI. He was involved in the original investigation into your father's financial crimes." The old man extended a gnarled hand. "Mr. Carter, I've been following your career. You're nothing like your father, from what I can see." "Thank you, I think," James said, shaking his hand. "Miguel says you have information about my mother." Donnelly nodded, reaching into a worn leather satchel. "I kept unofficial copies of some case files after I retired against regulations, but I never could let some cases go. Your mother's disappearance was one of them." He pulled out a manila envelope, yellowed with age. "I was the one who recruited Susan as an informant. She came to us, actually. Brought financial documents she'd found in your father's home office." She was terrified, not for herself, but for you. What happened the night she disappeared? James asked, the question that had haunted him for weeks. Donnelly's face darkened. I don't know for certain. She was supposed to meet me the next morning with additional evidence, but she never showed. When I tried to contact her, Richard told me she'd run off with another man. You didn't believe that? Not for a second. Susan was devoted to you. Everything she did, including informing on your father, was to protect you from his criminal connections. So, what do you think happened? Donnelly exchanged a glance with Miguel. We believe Victor Kruger, your father's security chief, intercepted her as she was trying to take you and run. What happened after that? He shook his head. Kruger's dead now. Heart attack 10 years ago. Whatever he did or didn't do, he took it to his grave. But you believe my mother survived? Yes. There were sightings of a woman matching her description in San Diego about 6 months after she disappeared. By then, the case against your father had collapsed without her testimony, and the Bureau had moved on to other priorities. But I kept tabs, followed leads on my own time, and I lost her trail in the mid-90s. She'd created a new identity by then. Susan Ramirez. The last confirmed sighting I had was in Los Angeles in 1994. James leaned forward. But you found something new. Donnelly nodded, removing a sealed evidence bag from the envelope. Inside was a letter, the paper creased and worn. This was found among Kruger's possessions after his death. His daughter turned it over to me because she knew I'd been looking for Susan. It was never mailed. James stared at the letter. It's from my mother. To you. Donnelly slid the bag across the table. I've kept it all these years, hoping to find you at the right moment. When Miguel contacted me, I knew the time had come. With trembling fingers, James opened the evidence bag and carefully removed the letter. The handwriting was shaky but legible. My dearest Jamie, if you're reading this, it means Mr. Kruger kept his promise, and you found out the truth. I pray that day comes while I'm still alive to see you again. The night I tried to take you away, everything went wrong. Your father discovered my plans. There was a terrible argument. I was so afraid he would hurt you to punish me. Mr. Kruger was there. He was supposed to stop me, but instead, he helped me escape. He couldn't let me take you. He said it was too dangerous, but he promised you'd be safe with your father. The next day, I saw the newspaper, the accident. They said you were dead, Jamie. My beautiful boy gone forever. I wanted to die too. Mr. Kruger found me. He told me, your father had fabricated the story, that you were alive and well, but that I could never contact you. Richard had evidence that would send me to prison for decades. If I ever tried to see you, he would use it. Mr. Kruger advised me to create a new life, a new identity, to protect myself. I didn't believe him at first, but then he showed me the obituary, the police reports, even funeral records, all fake. He says now, but so convincing, and I was broken, Jamie. Too broken to fight anymore for years. I visited a grave in San Diego, talking to a son who wasn't there. Eventually, I built a life as Susan Ramirez, moving from city to city, working in people's homes because it was all I knew how to do. I told everyone my son had drowned. It was easier than explaining the truth, which I barely understood myself. Now Mr. Kruger tells me he's dying. His conscience is troubling him. He says you've grown into a good man despite your father's influence. He wants to help me find you, to tell you the truth about why I disappeared. But I'm afraid, Jamie, afraid that after all these years, you'll hate me for not fighting harder, for believing the lies. If you're reading this, please try to understand. Not a day has passed that I haven't thought of you, loved you, missed you with every breath. You were my whole world. You still are. My heart broke when I lost you, but it has never stopped belonging to you. With all my love. Mama James lowered the letter, tears streaming down his face. She never mailed it. Kruger died before he could help her, Donnelly explained gently. Heart attack came on suddenly. The letter was found in his personal safe. He never told Susan he had it, so she still believes I'm dead. Yes, and according to Miguel, she's been working in your home without realizing who you are. James carefully folded the letter and placed it in his inside pocket, close to his heart. I need to tell her the truth. There's something else you should know, Miguel said. The DNA test results came back. I had the lab rush them. He handed James a sealed envelope. It's a match, James. Donna Susan is definitely your mother. James stared at the scientific confirmation of what his heart had already known. I need to go home now. As he stood, his phone buzzed with a text from Henderson. Sir, a gentleman just arrived asking for Donna Susan. Says he's an old friend. Something doesn't seem right. Should I allow him in? A chill ran down James's spine. He texted back quickly. What's his name? The reply came seconds later. Richard Carter. James's hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel, weaving through Chicago traffic with reckless speed. He'd called Henderson back immediately, instructing him to keep his father away from Susan at all costs. Tell him I'm on my way, James had ordered, and stay with Donna Susan. Don't leave her alone with him, even for a minute. As he drove, his mind raced through possible scenarios. What was his father planning after 35 years of maintaining his lie? Why risk exposing everything by confronting Susan directly, unless he felt truly cornered? Unless he believed the only way to preserve his secrets was to silence her permanently. The thought sent ice through James's veins. His father wasn't known for violence, but he was a man who solved problems ruthlessly, efficiently, and with whatever means necessary. James ran a red light, ignoring the blaring horns. His mother had spent decades believing her child was dead because of Richard's cruel deception. He wouldn't let her be hurt again. When James burst through the front door of the mansion, 20 minutes later, the foyer was eerily quiet. Henderson, he called out, his voice echoing. Donna Susan. No response. James moved quickly through the first floor, checking rooms as he went. The kitchen was empty. Cooking preparations abandoned mid-task. A knife on the cutting board, vegetables half chopped. Henderson, he shouted again, fear climbing up his throat. In the study, sir, came the strained reply. James sprinted down the hallway and threw open the study door. Richard Carter stood by the fireplace, drink in hand, as if he owned the place. Henderson stood rigidly by the door, his usual composure fractured by obvious tension. And there, seated in a leather armchair, pale but composed, was Donna Susan. James, Richard greeted him with manufactured calm. I was just getting reacquainted with an old friend. Get out, James said, his voice deadly quiet. Get out of my house right now. That's no way to speak to your father, son, Richard admonished, as if scolding a child. Especially when I've come all this way to protect your interests. My interests? James laughed bitterly. You've never protected anyone's interests but your own. Mr. Carter? Henderson interjected carefully. Should I call security? No need, James said, keeping his eyes on his father. Mr. Henderson, would you please escort Donna Susan to the guest house and stay with her there? I need to speak with my father privately. Richard's eyes narrowed. The lady stays. We have unfinished business. The lady, James said, emphasizing the word, is my employee and my guest. She'll go where she feels safest. He turned to Susan, whose dark eyes were moving between father and son with growing comprehension. Donna Susan, please go with Henderson. I'll come find you when this is over. For a moment, she seemed about to refuse. Then, with quiet dignity, she stood and moved toward the door. Richard set down his glass. Susan, he said sharply. Susan Carter, don't pretend you don't remember me. She paused, her back straightening. Slowly, she turned to face Richard, her expression hardening into something James had never seen before. I remember you perfectly, Richard, she said, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. I've spent 35 years trying to forget, but some nightmares stay with you. Richard smiled coldly. Always the dramatist. Tell me, does my son know who you really are? Does he know you abandoned him as a child? That you're a thief who stole from her own family? That's enough, James cut in. Henderson, please take Donna Susan to the guest house now. Yes, sir. Henderson gently guided Susan toward the door, but she hesitated, looking back at James with newfound intensity, searching his face as if seeing him for the first time. Jamie, she whispered, the simple childhood nickname cracking something open inside him. James nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging his throat. Go with Henderson, he managed finally. Please, I'll explain everything soon. After a long moment, she allowed Henderson to lead her from the room. When the door closed behind them, James turned to his father. How did you know she was here? Richard shrugged, retrieving his drink. I have friends in various agencies. Facial recognition software is remarkably effective these days. When you started asking questions about your mother, I put some safeguards in place. Safeguards, James repeated flatly. You had her under surveillance. Not her specifically, just monitoring for certain names, faces, patterns of inquiry that might become problematic. You're unbelievable. After everything you've done to her, to us, you're still treating her like a threat to be neutralized. Richard's expression hardened. She was a threat. She was going to destroy our family, our legacy, by exposing your crimes, by trying to protect me from growing up surrounded by corruption, by taking you away from me, Richard shouted, his composure finally cracking. You were my son, mine, the only thing in my life that mattered. I wasn't a person to you. I was a possession, an extension of your ego. I gave you everything, Richard hissed. Education, opportunities, wealth. And you took away the one thing I needed most, James interrupted. My mother, a woman who loved me for myself, not as some dynastic heir, Richard scoffed. Sentimental garbage. Love doesn't build empires. No, but it builds people, Dad, real people, not empty suits with stock portfolios where their hearts should be. James moved to his desk and pressed a button on the intercom. Davis, please come to the study. Within moments, a security guard appeared at the door. Davis, my father is leaving now. Please escort him to his car. Richard straightened his tie, regaining his composure with practiced ease. This isn't over, James. Think carefully about your next move. There are still things you don't know, consequences you haven't considered. If you're threatening her, or me, save your breath. I have everything I need to expose what you did 35 years ago, the money laundering, the fabricated evidence against Mom, even your connection to Detective Martinez's death. Fear flickered briefly across Richard's face before being masked by cold anger. You'd destroy your own father, the Carter name, everything we've built. You destroyed it the moment you separated a mother from her child and spent decades maintaining that lie. James nodded to the security guard. Davis, please make sure my father leaves the property. This is a mistake, James, Richard warned as he was led to the door. A mistake you'll regret when he was gone. James slumped into his chair, the full weight of the confrontation hitting him. For decades, his relationship with his father had been his primary familial connection. Complicated, often tense, but fundamental to his identity. Now, it lay in ruins, exposed as a construction built on lies and manipulation. But in its place was the possibility of something he'd thought forever lost, a relationship with his mother. James pulled out his phone and called Miguel. He came to the house, James said without preamble. He confronted her directly. Is she all right? Miguel asked immediately. Yes, she's safe. But she recognized me. Or at least she suspects. I need to tell her everything. Do you want me there? I have all the evidence. The documentation? No, James interrupted gently. This needs to be just us. But thank you, Miguel, for everything. After hanging up, James sat motionless for several minutes, gathering his courage. Then he stood and walked toward the guest house where his mother was waiting. The path felt longer than usual. Each step weighted with the magnitude of what was about to happen. This conversation would change everything, would reconnect threads severed 35 years ago by his father's cruelty. At the guest house door, James paused, hand raised to knock. On the other side was the woman who had given him life, who had tried to protect him, who had grieved him as dead for decades while he grew up believing she had abandoned him. How did one begin such a conversation? What words could possibly bridge such an abyss of lost time and mutual pain? Taking a deep breath, James knocked on the door. Henderson opened the guest house door. She's in the sitting room, sir, he said quietly. Would you like me to stay? James shook his head. No, thank you. We need privacy. He hesitated, then added, make sure we're not disturbed by anyone. Of course. Sir, Henderson's usual professional demeanor softened slightly. Good luck. The guest house was small compared to the mansion, but still elegant. A cottage-style retreat with comfortable furnishings and large windows overlooking the garden. James found his mother standing by one of those windows, her back to him, arms wrapped tightly around herself as if for protection. She turned when she heard his footsteps. Her face was composed, but her eyes were red-rimmed from recent tears. Is he gone? She asked. Yes, he won't bother you again. She studied his face with an intensity that made him want to look away. You called me by my real name, Susan Carter. Yes. How long have you known? James moved further into the room but maintained his distance, sensing her need for space. I've suspected for weeks, since I heard you saying the guardian angel prayer in the kitchen. I only had it confirmed today. She nodded slowly, processing this. And you are James Carter, your son. The words hung in the air between them. Susan's hand moved to her heart, pressing against her chest as if to contain the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. That's not possible, she whispered. My Jamie died. There was an accident. A drowning. There was no accident, James said gently. It was a lie. A cruel deception engineered by my father to keep you from coming back for me. She shook her head, disbelieving. No, I saw the obituary, the funeral notice. Richard showed me police reports. All fabricated. James took a step toward her. Mom, I never died. You never abandoned me. We were both victims of my father's manipulation. Susan sank onto the sofa, her legs seemingly unable to support her. How can I believe this? After all these years, James approached cautiously and sat across from her. From his pocket, he withdrew the letter, her letter, and placed it on the coffee table between them. This was found among Victor Kruger's possessions after he died. The letter you wrote to me that was never mailed. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. How did you get this? A retired FBI agent named Frank Donnelly kept it. He was the one who recruited you as an informant all those years ago. Susan unfolded the letter, her eyes filling with tears as she recognized her own handwriting. I remember writing this. Mr. Kruger promised he would help me find you, tell you the truth. He died before he could, James explained softly. But the letter survived, and now, after all these years, I finally know what really happened. Susan read her own words silently, tears streaming down her face. When she finished, she looked up at James, really seeing him, looking past the successful businessman to the child she had lost. Jamie, she whispered, the name like a prayer. My baby boy. James felt his own composure crumbling. I thought you left me all these years. I believed you chose to walk away. Never, Susan said fiercely. I would have died before leaving you willingly. You were everything to me. What happened that night? The night you tried to take me away? Susan closed her eyes, the painful memories washing over her face. I had found documents in your father's office, evidence of money laundering, connections to organized crime. When I confronted him, he threatened me, not directly. Richard was too clever for that, but I knew what he meant. She opened her eyes, focusing on a point in the distance. I decided to take you and run. I had contacted the FBI, was working with them to build a case against Richard, but I was terrified of what might happen if his criminal associates discovered I was informing. So you packed a bag for us? James prompted gently. She nodded. I waited until Richard was supposed to be at his weekly club meeting, but he suspected something. He came home early, caught me packing your things. Her voice faltered. The fight was terrible. He said he'd destroy me, that I'd never see you again. And Kruger was there. Yes, Richard's security man. I thought he was there to stop me, maybe even hurt me. But after Richard stormed out to make some calls, Kruger told me to run, said it wasn't safe for me anymore. That Richard's associates would come for me once they knew I'd been talking to the FBI. But he wouldn't let you take me, James said. Susan's hands clenched into fists. He said you'd be safer with your father, that Richard would never hurt his own son, his heir, but that if I stayed or tried to take you, we'd both be in danger. She looked up at James, anguish in her eyes. I didn't want to leave you, but Kruger convinced me it was the only way to keep you safe. He promised he'd watch over you. And then you saw the obituary. Yes, a few days later. Her voice broke. It said there had been an accident, that you had drowned during a weekend trip with your father. There were details, so many details. The location, the recovery of your body. James reached out impulsively and took her hand. It felt small and warm in his, the hand that had once held his as a child. When I saw it, something inside me died, Susan continued. I couldn't function, couldn't think. That's when Kruger found me again. He said it was all Richard's doing, a fabrication to ensure I would never try to contact you or return to Chicago. But you didn't believe him. He showed me the obituary, police reports, funeral arrangements. Everything looked so real. And I was broken, too shattered to fight anymore. She squeezed his hand. I wanted to believe Kruger, but it seemed impossible that Richard could fake something so elaborate, involve so many officials. He had the connections, the money, the influence, James said. And you were already vulnerable. Isolated. Susan nodded, wiping away tears. Kruger advised me to create a new identity, to protect myself from Richard's reach. I became Susan Ramirez, widow of Roberto, mother of a drowned son. It wasn't hard to play the grieving mother. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I wasn't acting. And all this time, I was growing up believing you'd abandon me for another life, James said. That's what Dad told me, that you'd found someone else, chosen to start over without us. Susan's expression hardened. Your father stole decades from us, years we can never get back. But we have now, James said, his throat tight with emotion. However many years are left to us, we have them together. She reached out tentatively, her hand hovering near his face as if afraid he might disappear. You look so much like him. I know, James said, understanding her mixed feelings. But I'm told I have your eyes. You do, she confirmed, a small smile breaking through her tears. And your heart, your kindness. I've seen it these past weeks. How you treat your staff, your quiet generosity. That's not Richard. That's the part of you that's me. Unable to maintain his composure any longer, James moved to sit beside her on the sofa. Susan hesitated only a moment before opening her arms. As he leaned into her embrace, feeling her arms wrap around him for the first time in 35 years, James felt something long broken inside him begin to heal. My son, Susan whispered into his hair. My beautiful boy. I've missed so much. We both have, James said. But we'll make up for lost time. I promise. They stayed that way for a long time. Mother and son reunited, each reluctant to break the embrace they had been denied for decades. Outside, the sun began to set, casting the guest house in soft golden light. Finally, Susan pulled back slightly, searching his face. What happens now? With your father? James's expression grew serious. He needs to face consequences for what he did. To us, and to others through his criminal activities. I have evidence, documentation. But first, he took her hand. First, I want us to have time together. Just us. The rest can wait a little longer. Susan nodded, a lifetime of pain beginning to lift from her shoulders. I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day. I know, James said. I know that now. The state of Illinois versus Richard Carter. The bailiff's voice echoed through the crowded courtroom as Richard was led in, immaculately dressed in a custom-tailored suit despite his prisoner status. 10 months had passed since the day James had confronted his father and reunited with his mother. 10 months of investigations, depositions, and legal maneuvering, as decades of financial crimes were finally brought to light. James sat in the front row beside Susan, their hands linked tightly as they watched Richard take his place at the defense table. He hadn't looked at them, hadn't acknowledged their presence, but James felt the weight of his father's calculated indifference like a physical force. You don't have to be here, he whispered to his mother. No one would blame you for skipping this. Susan straightened her shoulders, her gaze steady on the man who had stolen so much from her. I need to see this through, we both do. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. Richard had eventually accepted a plea deal, rather than face a public trial that would expose every sordid detail of his criminal empire. Today was his sentencing hearing, the final chapter in a story that had spanned more than 3 decades. As the prosecutor outlined the charges and recommended sentence, James found his mind wandering back over the past 10 months. The weeks after his reunion with Susan had been a whirlwind of emotion and adjustment. She had moved from her small apartment into the guest house, both of them recognizing the need for some space as they navigated their new reality. They spent long evenings together, filling in the missing pieces of their lives, rebuilding a relationship that had been brutally interrupted. James learned about his mother's struggles, the grief that had nearly consumed her, The years of moving from city to city, the quiet dignity with which she had rebuilt her life. Susan discovered the lonely child her son had been, the formidable businessman he'd become, and the empty spaces in his life that mirrored her own. The legal proceedings against Richard had begun almost immediately. James had turned over all the evidence to federal prosecutors, including Frank Donnelly's preserved case files and the financial records Miguel had uncovered. Richard had been arrested at his penthouse, the media capturing the perp walk of one of Chicago's most prominent businessmen. The scandal had rocked the city's financial community. Carter Investments' stock plummeted initially, but James had been prepared, implementing contingency plans to protect employees and legitimate investors. He'd spent months restructuring the company, purging any remaining connections to his father's illegal activities, and rebuilding its reputation on a foundation of transparency and ethical practice. "Mr. Carter, would you like to address the court?" The judge's voice pulled James back to the present. Richard stood, buttoning his jacket with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to boardrooms and power. "Your Honor, I've acknowledged my wrongdoing and accepted responsibility through my guilty plea. I built a business that provided jobs for thousands and contributed significantly to Chicago's economy. I ask the court to consider that legacy alongside my mistakes." James felt Susan's hand tighten around his. His father's mistakes had torn apart their family, had stolen a mother from her child, had caused decades of unnecessary pain, and yet he spoke of them as mere footnotes to his supposed achievements. The judge seemed equally unimpressed. "Mr. Carter, you've pleaded guilty to multiple counts of money laundering, obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and fraud, crimes spanning more than 30 years. Your business success does not mitigate the harm you've caused." She consulted her notes. "I hereby sentence you to 15 years in federal prison." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Richard's face remained impassive, but James caught the slight tightening of his jaw, the only indication that the sentence had affected him. As the bailiff led Richard away, he finally turned, his eyes meeting James's for a brief moment. There was no remorse there, no acknowledgement of the pain he'd caused, only cold calculation, already planning for whatever came next. Then he was gone, and it was over. "It still doesn't feel real," Susan said later as they walked through the garden behind the mansion. Spring had arrived in Chicago, bringing new life to the carefully tended grounds. After all these years, to see him actually face consequences. 15 years isn't enough for what he did to you," James said, his voice tight. "To us. No prison sentence could restore what we lost," Susan agreed. "But it's not about revenge, Jamie. It's about justice and closure. Now we can truly move forward." They paused by a newly installed fountain, a simple, elegant design Susan had chosen to replace the ostentatious marble monstrosity Richard had originally commissioned. "The house feels different now," James observed, looking back at the mansion. "Warmer," Susan smiled. "A house becomes what its people make it, remember? In the months since their reunion, the Carter estate had undergone a transformation, not through renovation or redesign, but through the spirit that now animated it. The formal rooms that had stood mostly unused were now regular gathering spaces. The kitchen had become the heart of the home, with Susan teaching James the family recipes she'd once prepared for him as a child. "Have you thought more about my proposal?" James asked as they continued their walk. After the initial shock of the reunion had settled, James had suggested creating a foundation, one dedicated to reuniting families separated by injustice, and supporting those rebuilding their lives after incarceration or wrongful conviction. "I have," Susan said, "and I'd be honored to help lead it. I've been looking into similar organizations, identifying gaps in services we could fill." James smiled, unsurprised by his mother's proactive approach. In the past months, he'd discovered that Susan's quiet demeanor masked a formidable intelligence and determination, qualities that had enabled her to survive decades of heartbreak and build a life from nothing. "We'll need a name for it," he said. "What about the Guardian Angel Foundation?" Susan suggested, after the prayer that brought us back together. James nodded, the rightness of it resonating immediately. Perfect. They had reached the small garden chapel James had built at the far end of the property, a peaceful sanctuary where Susan often came to pray or simply sit in contemplation. "There's something else I wanted to discuss with you," James said, suddenly nervous. "I've been thinking about the mansion." "Oh," Susan looked up at him questioningly. "It's too big for just us. And despite the changes we've made, it still holds too many memories of him." James took a deep breath. "I'm thinking about selling it, starting fresh somewhere new, somewhere without his shadow hanging over us." Susan considered this, her expression thoughtful. "Where would we go?" "Wherever you want," James said simply. "Chicago, if you've grown attached to it, or somewhere completely different. The foundation can operate from anywhere." "I'd like to be near the lake," Susan said after a moment. "I've always found peace near water, but smaller, more comfortable, a real home, not a showpiece." "Then that's what we'll do," James promised. "I'll have real estate agents start looking immediately." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. So much had changed in less than a year. Lives transformed, truths uncovered, a family reborn from the ashes of decades-old lies. "Jamie," Susan said softly, "I want you to know something. I've spent 35 years grieving for you, thinking you were gone forever. Even now, sometimes I look at you and can hardly believe you're real, that we found each other against such impossible odds." "I know," James said, taking her hand. "I feel the same way. But each day, it gets a little easier to believe. Each day I'm a little less afraid that this will all disappear." She smiled up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Today, watching your father face justice, I finally felt free of the fear that's followed me for so long." "We both are," James said, "free to build something new together." As the evening settled around them, James and Susan made their way back to the house, where warm lights glowed welcomingly in the windows. Whatever the future held, they would face it together, mother and son, their bond tested by decades of separation but ultimately unbroken. Inside, they stood side by side in the kitchen, preparing dinner as they had begun to do most evenings. And as they worked, Susan softly began to murmur the guardian angel prayer, the same prayer that had bridged 35 years of separation and brought them, against all odds, back to each other, back to each. James joined in, their voices blending in the ancient words of protection and hope. "Angel of God, my guardian dear, to whom God's love commits me here, ever this day be at my side, to light, to guard, to rule, and guide." The circle was complete. The broken family, at last, made whole.